students, I'm Asha Sharma, your educator. In this video, we are going to talk about another concept related to communication, and it is called as the barriers to communication. Now, as we all know, what is communication? Communication is the delivering of facts, figures, emotions. It can be in the verbal or in the non-verbal form between two people. It can be only the person communicating with themselves. It can be in a group, or it can be mass communication, right? It can be between two cultures as well. So there are always barriers when this type of communication happens. There can be barriers. These barriers are also called as obstacles or hindrances that can hinder or obstruct the communication. So a healthy communication is always that communication that is effective, that has less number of barriers. Okay. So there can be various types of barriers. What are these barriers to communication? Any obstacle or problem in the process of communication which hinders, which creates a problem, and which obstructs the process of communication is termed as a barrier. There are different barriers like semantic barriers, also called as language barriers, physiological barriers, psychological barriers, physical barriers, cultural barriers. So these are the barriers that can come in between. And whenever you want to have a good communication, what you have to do is to do away with all kinds of entrophies, and you need to find out what are the various obstacles coming in between. For example, if you really want to communicate with other person but you have inferiority complex, then it can create problems. What if you are scared of another person? What if you have a preconceived notion or a prejudice against someone? Or maybe you do not know same language, or you're trying to communicate with your boss using informal manner of communication. Right? So these are the various barriers that can pop up in between. So a good communicator, a good person who's communicating is someone who knows which medium to use, how to minimize these kinds of barriers. These barriers are also called as noise, and these noise are ever pervasive. They are always present. And what is our role? Our role is to minimize these noises and these barriers to communication. So let us discuss different barriers. First is the physical or the environmental barrier. The barrier in the surrounding or in the environment are termed as the physical barriers. It can be noise. It can be that, for example, I am taking a class, but there is a lot of noise coming from outside and the students are not able to hear my voice. So this can create problem. Maybe time and distance are not matching, or the wrong selection of medium is also is also major cause of any kind of obstacle that can happen. For example, as we two are talking, suppose me and my friend are talking, and this should be an informal conversation, but what I did, I wrote an email to my friend, do you want to play today? Right? So what happens, this is supposed to be an informal communication, but because of the wrong selection of medium, my friend won't be able to respond. The communication would be delayed. It should be informal, but I chose a formal way of communicating. So it is important to choose the correct medium to communicate with the other person. Then there is this type of barrier that is called as the semantic barrier or the language barrier is the most important kind of barrier. A lot of questions are asked from semantic or language barrier. It is also called as the linguistic barrier. So barriers that arise due to different languages or differences in language can create a problem in the communication process. These barriers are called as the semantic barriers. For example, lack of common language. I am talking to you in French and you do not know French, right? So this will create a problem. Multiplicity of words can create problem. And what is this multiplicity of words? Word can have a lot of other meanings as well. There can be different words that can be used, or words with similar pronunciation but different meanings. This can also create a lot of problem. Then there can be jargon. These jargons are also these jargons also create a lot of problems. Now, what are jargons? For example, you went to the chemist and you said that you need this medicine, and of course the chemist would talk amongst one another about various salts. So you are not able to understand these salts, but they very well understand that what the doctor has prescribed to you, right? So these terms that you hear, these are jargons. They are very specific to a particular field, and often problems are created if you are not aware about these jargons. Okay, so jargons, multiplicity of words with similar pronunciation but different meanings, these can create a lot of problems. There can be bad expression. You used a very bad expression. It can create a barrier. It can be words with different meanings. It can be faulty translations, unclarified assumptions, denotations and connotations can also create problem. Then jargons, as I told you, these are the semantic barriers, and often questions are asked from the semantic barrier. Then we have the psychological barrier. Now, psychological barrier, as the word itself is very explicitly telling you, everything that is associated with the psyche, that means your brain, is called as, these are called as the psychological barriers. So barriers or problems arising due to stress or psychological problems are termed as psychological barriers. It is very difficult to accept and sometimes to overcome it. And also you don't even realize that this was a barrier. For example, maybe you have this anxiety issue and you're not able to communicate with the other person. You yourself are not aware that this triggered you and you had anxiety, right? So these are the small things that can happen, and this can create problems. So there can be prejudice against another person, your overwhelming emotions or feelings, close-mindedness, self-image, poor retention. These are the various problems that can hinder the communication process, or an effective communication can be hindered. For example, a person has a very defensive attitude. It can be if the other person feels that they are being attacked too much, or lack of sympathy and empathy can be a major problem. Or maybe information filtering is a problem because a selective perception and retention is seen. Then lack of trust can be a problem. Fear of being judged by the other person can create a lot of problem, right? Ego can create a lot of problems. So these are the various psychological barriers that can cause a problem, that can hinder the communication that is present. Then there are socio-cultural barriers. Now, what is actually a cultural communication? When two different cultures are trying to communicate with one another, maybe they are assimilating, they're trying to accommodate, acculturation, inculturation is happening, right? When these two cultures are trying to talk to one another or trying to communicate with one another, then you call it as a cultural communication. Okay, so due to the differences of the social status or the culture, the barrier can also, or the cultural barriers, you can also face a lot of problems in communication. These are called as the socio-cultural barriers. For example, the concept of time can be very different in one culture and very different in another culture. Maybe concept of color. For example, in a Western culture, when someone dies, black is something that they wear. But in our culture, we wear white. So the color also, the significance of color changes as the culture changes. So this can also be a barrier. Assumptions about the social strata or about the caste system can also create problem. Etiquettes and manners can create problem, right? So these are the various ways in which you see hindrances if you do not pay focus to the other culture. If you have preconceived notions about the other culture, this definitely is going to become a barrier between the people who are talking from different cultures. Then organizational barriers are also prevalent nowadays. We all work and we all know that while you are working, there are definitely delegation of works. And of course, it is important to talk to the other person when you're working in a organization. So in that organization, a healthy communication, whether it is downward or upward, whether it is vertical or horizontal, is needed. But if there are entrophies, if there are barriers, then everything can become a total loss. So organizational barriers are those barriers that are caused due to various structures. Maybe the rules and regulations of the office are very strict. Regulations that are present in the organization are very, very rigid. So this can create problems and obstacles. Complexity of organizational structure, or maybe multiple managers whom you need to report to, this can often create problems. Then we have, last but not the least, the physiological barriers. So these physiological barriers arise when a sender or a receiver of the communication is not in the position to express or receive the message. Right? Maybe the sender or the receiver, they are not in the position to send or receive the message, right? There is no clarity due to the physiological issues. For example, say the person who you are trying to communicate is dyslexic, or maybe you have a nervous disorder. This can create a lot of problem. Understanding the words, this can also interfere with the speech and hearing. So these disorders or these hindrances are often termed as the physiological barriers. So these were the various barriers, and they often come in between when you are trying to communicate with another person. In day-to-day life also, when you will look into things very minutely, you will realize that these barriers are always present. They're ever pervasive. And a good communication is that communication that is effective. And for being effective, you have to do away with these barriers. So knowing the barriers is the first step to actually avoid all of these things. Let us quickly revise what we discussed. So we discussed that there are various barriers to communication. Barriers can also be termed as noise, obstacles, or hindrances in communication. These barriers can be physical, then it can be language, semantic. It is also called as linguistic barrier. Then it can be your psychological and your physiological barriers. Then you have socio-cultural barriers. Then you have organizational barriers. And yeah, this is the physiological. So these are the various barriers that can come up in between. And for a good communication to happen, you have to do away with those barriers. Right? So I hope you understood today's video and you understood the concept clearly and vividly. If you have any doubt, you can ask me that in the comment section and I'll surely reply to you. Thank you.